Hey everybody, welcome to Chapter 4, Section 2, Part 1, over complex numbers. So, let me talk to you about what a complex number is. A complex number is anything that has an imaginary number in it. So, what is an imaginary number? Well, an imaginary number is defined as the square root of -1. All right? And it's denoted by this I, okay? So, what does the square root of -1 mean? Well, to talk about that, you need to think about what does a square root mean. A square root means it's basically the inverse of a square, right? Like 4 times 4 is 16. So the square root of 16 is 4. But what if you try taking the square root of a negative number? Well, if I try taking the square root of a negative number, I'd get a no solution because a negative times a negative is a positive, like -4 times -4 is positive 16. So therefore, we can say the square root of 16 is plus or minus 4, positive or -4. So if I took the square root of -16, I wouldn't say the answer is -4 because the square root of positive 16 could be -4. But the square root of -16, I can't multiply two of the same numbers to get a negative number, right? By definition, if you're squaring something, you're multiplying two of the exact same number. I need to do like 4 times -4, and that's not a square. That's just doing 4 times -4, okay? So what we do in the field of math is we call those imaginary numbers when you're trying to take the square root or an even root of a negative number. So the simplest form of a negative square root is the square root of -1. So that's called I. So here's a little example. What's the square root of -4? So if we're going to simplify that, we're going to just split it up. You can always split up a square root as long as you're taking the square root of both numbers. I know -4 can be written as 4 times -1, all right? And I know the square root of 4 is positive or -2, because -2 times -2 is 4, positive 2 times positive 2 is 4. And then the square root of -1 is I. So the final answer is plus or minus 2I. So long story short, when you're taking the square root of a negative number, just take the square root of the number as if it were positive, and then don't forget to put your plus or minus sign by it, and then don't forget to put the I by it. So, on example A, the square root of -9. Well, the square root of 9 would be 3, and then when you do the square root, you have to say plus or minus 3. And then since it's a -9, I say 3I. That's it. Looking at example B, I meant to write down the square root of -49, and I only wrote down the square root of -4, which I already went over. So, square root of -49, well, what's the square root of positive 49? That's 7. Technically, it's plus or minus 7. Okay, positive 7 times positive 7 is 49. -7 times -7 is 49. And then since it was a -49, you put an I by it. That's all there is to say about it. I made another goof on this one. I put the negative on the outside. If the negative's on the outside, there is no I. It is just plus or minus 4. So if there's a negative on the inside, it's still plus or minus 4, since that's the square root of 16. Let me write this 4 a little neater. But put an I by it. That's all there is to say about that. Okay? Hope that makes sense. So letter D, you have a fraction. We'll take the square root of each number on top and on bottom in the numerator and the denominator. What's the square root of 4? 2. What's the square root of 9? 3. Every time you take the square root, put a plus or minus symbol by it. And then since this was a negative number, put an I there. And that's it. So letter E is a little different. You have a -5 times the square root of -9. So it's on the outside, so that's why I said times. Anything written right next to each other, they're multiplying. So really what we have here is -5 times, and then we have a plus or minus 3I All right, so that's the square root of 9. Negative 9 is the plus or minus 3i. And so now let's just do negative 5 times that, because you can multiply any two numbers together, okay? So 5 times 3 is 15, and 5 times 3i would be 15i. And it doesn't really matter that this was a negative 5, because you're doing a negative 5 times a positive 3i and a negative 5 times a negative 3i, so you're still getting a plus or minus answer. So that is that. F is, kind of similar but a little different. So the square root of negative 72. If you type in the square root of 72, your calculator is going to tell you give you a decimal answer. All right, and we don't want decimal answers. So we need to think of our perfect squares. In other words, your perfect squares are 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared, 6 squared, and so on. So what is a perfect square that goes into 72? So again, like what's 1 squared? That's 1. What's 2 squared? That's 4. 3 squared? That's 9. 4 squared? That's 5. 5 squared? That's 25. I said 4 squared? That's 5. 4 squared? That's 16. 5 squared, 25. 6 squared, 36. 36 goes into 72. 72 is 36 times 2. So one of these numbers needs to be negative since it was a negative 72. So I just put the negative for the one that you can take the square root of, because when I take the square root of negative 36, that's just plus or minus 6i, because the square root of 36 is plus or minus 6, so you throw the I by it. The square root of 2 that's where the decimal is coming from, the square root of 2. So it's not going to simplify beyond that. All right? So you're allowed to split up a number when you're taking the square root or whatever root you're doing of it. You're allowed to split it up into factors where one of them has a square root. Just as long as you're taking the square root of both terms, which is why I have both under the radical there. Okay? And then what you can take the square root of goes on the outside in its square rooted form. And then what you can't take the square root of stays behind inside the square root form. And this way you write the answer. This is the way you simplify the answer without getting any decimals. So letter G is pretty much the same thing. I know that 12 is 6 times 2, but 6 doesn't have a square root, 2 doesn't have a square root. I also know that 12 is 4 times 3. 4 has a square root, but 3 doesn't. Oh, you only need to think, only one of them needs to have a square root. So if you get stuck trying to think of two numbers that have a square root, you'll just be confusing yourself. So 12 is 4 times 3, and then 4 can be square rooted, so I'll make that one negative. So I'm doing the square root of negative 4, which is plus or minus 2i, and the square root of 3 is just the square root of 3, and that's my final answer. So that's that. So this was just simplifying square roots of negative numbers, or simplifying and writing them as a complex number. So now let's do some just adding and subtracting complex numbers. So adding and subtracting complex numbers is pretty simple in that it's just like combining like terms. So a complex number is a number with an I by it. And so if you're adding and subtracting them, you're going to add the I letters together and the non-I letters add together separately, but you keep them separate. I cannot simplify 8 minus I and say that's like, 7i. It just stays separate, okay? So you write your answers in standard form. What does standard form mean? It just means like some number x plus some number yi. So the I term comes second, okay? And then you'll notice all my examples are set up with some parentheses. Parentheses only matter if there's a negative outside of them. If there's a number right outside of them, yeah, you distribute. But if there's a positive outside, it doesn't change anything. So I have 8 minus I plus 5 plus 4i. So the distributing a positive doesn't change any signs, only distributing a negative. So what's 8 plus 5? 13. What's negative I plus 4I? That's 3I. That's it. That's all there is to it. Just combine like terms like you have been doing with like what's 6x plus 2 plus, I don't know, 8x. You would just add the 6x and the 8x to make 14x plus 2. So for letter B, I have a negative that you have to distribute. Always distribute the negative. So this is 7 minus 6i minus 3, and then turns into plus 6i. So I'm going to do 7 minus 3, that's 4. And then negative 6i plus 6i makes 0. Here, I'll just write 0i. It really doesn't matter. So 4 plus 0i, that's just, the answer is 4. But I wrote the 0i to hopefully make it less confusing. This would cancel this out. So C, we have to distribute this negative 13 minus 2 minus 7i plus 5i. 13 minus 2 is 11. Negative 7i plus 5i is negative 2i. That's letter C. Letter D, 10 minus 2i plus 3. So we're not distributing anything. It's a plus. So 10 plus 3 is 13. Negative 2i plus I is just negative 1i. And that's D. E, there is a negative. Whoops. So I'm going to distribute that. Negative 6 minus 5i minus 2 plus 5i. Oh, look, this is just like the last one. Your i's cancel. That makes 0i. So what's negative 6 minus 2? That's negative 8. And then, so my final answer is just negative 8. And the last example I have on this video, I'm going to distribute this negative. So 20 plus 1 minus 8i plus 4i. And then 20 plus 1 is 21. Negative 8i plus 4i is negative 4i. And all these were written in standard form where the I term comes second. And that's going to close it for the notes. Stay tuned for part 2. Thanks. Bye.